with one polished, icy phone call in the courtyard of a small hotel in Tuscany. I was pushed out of the very deal I had spent 13 days keeping alive. They thought they were replacing one difficult woman with a smoother face. OfficePolitics. A more obedient voice. But what they really removed from that room was not me. It was the memory of the negotiation. The last layer of trust between Belmar and the Bennett family, and the final buffer, keeping internal vanity from turning into a documented, expensive crisis. I remember the exact moment Victoria Hale's call cut through the afternoon like a polished blade. I was standing in the courtyard of a small hotel in Tuscany, still holding the signing folder for the Bennett deal. Still running through delivery sequence. Margin tolerance. And the last clean version of a draft I had fought to protect from a dozen executive vanity edits. Victoria's voice came through my phone smooth enough to fool anyone who did not know her. I did. I had spent too many years around people who used refinement as camouflage for cruelty. She told me I had forgotten who I worked for. I answered that I worked for Belmar. She replied that I worked for people who could replace me. That one sentence changed the air around me. Everything outside stayed irritatingly ordinary. A waiter crossed the courtyard carrying empty glasses. Somewhere beyond the gate, a scooter rattled by. But inside me, the line had already been crossed. I understand pressure, deadlines, cost exposure, production mistakes, executive demands. All of that has its own logic. This was not pressure. This was humiliation with a corporate accent. Victoria wanted me to remember my place. Wanted me to hear clearly that my work only mattered until it threatened her visibility. I did not argue. I did not plead. I did not give her the reaction she was probably waiting for. I kept my voice level, and that seemed to bother her more than tears would have. By the end of the call, I understood exactly what was happening. They were not fixing a problem. They were proving that they had the power to remove a woman from the board at the moment she mattered most. And the people who do that always believe the removal itself is the lesson. They almost never understand that sometimes the real lesson begins after the person they dismissed stops holding the damage in place. Only minutes after Victoria ended the call, Lauren Pierce from Human Resources sent the email. It was clean, cold, and written in that careful language corporations use when they want violence to sound administrative.com. Effective immediately. I was being removed from the Bennett account pending internal review. Ethan Cole would assume coverage for the signing at the start of the week. I read it once, then again. Not because I was confused, but because I wanted to be certain that this level of recklessness had actually been put into writing. Ethan had never sat across from Edward Bennett. He did not know which line in that draft had only survived because I had softened it over multiple conversations. He did not know which concession had already cost that family too much pride to ever be requested again. He did not know where silence mattered, where directness mattered, or where one wrong sentence could cool an entire room. The absurd part was that headquarters probably thought they had just solved a personnel issue. In reality, what they removed was not a difficult personality. What they removed was the living memory of the negotiation. I stood there alone in the courtyard with my phone in my hand and felt as if I were looking at a fine crack running through glass. From a distance, it might not seem serious, but I knew exactly how little pressure it would take for everything to split open. I did not let myself get angry right then. Anger makes women in companies easy to dismiss as emotional, even when we are the only ones seeing the danger, clearly. So I named the facts to myself instead. No transition meeting. No continuity discussion. No external risk review. Just a neat show of force designed to remind me that, in the eyes of a few people in New York, their ego still mattered more than the survival of a live international deal. What kept me steady was not a lack of hurt. It was clarity. I knew the real value I carried in that deal, even if the people at headquarters preferred not to admit it. The Bennett family did not trust Belmar because of impressive titles or glossy leadership presence. They trusted me because I had never sold them a polished lie. If production could meet a timeline, I said yes. If it could not, I said no before somebody in New York turned optimism into a trap. Over the years, I learned that trust in cross-border business is not built through visible power. It is built through repetition, through consistency, through a person sounding the same, when things are smooth and when they are under strain. That was why the Bennetts came to me when they needed an answer that was not pretty but true. I was not the flashiest representative Belmar had. I was not the most visible name on executive emails. But I was the one who knew which promise had already been stretched too far, which clause would feel insulting if pushed harder, and which moment required restraint instead of theater. Victoria never understood that kind of value. To her, value had to be visible. A name on a confirmation chain. A seat in the room. A face in the photograph at the end. My work lived in the less glamorous place where value stays invisible until it disappears and the whole structure starts to shake. If you're still with me here? Comment number 1. Because some of you already know that the people holding the roof up are not always the ones standing under the brightest lights. I was not flattering myself. I simply knew what role they were trying to deny. And that knowledge kept me calm. They could erase my name from an email in 1 minute. They could not replace the trust I had built through accuracy. Patience. And truth spoken at the right time. Belmar had bruised its relationship with the Bennett family long before I arrived in Tuscany. Late changes. Abrupt demands. That elegant kind of disrespect companies call efficiency when they are aiming it at people overseas. I had seen all of it. Large companies often behave as if physical distance will blur the damage of arrogance. It does not. People like Edward Bennett remember exactly how they were made to wait. How a sentence sounded when it crossed into condescension. And how a decision from headquarters can step on the dignity of the other side without anyone in New York feeling the force of it. I spent 13 days undoing that damage, one conversation at a time. Not with performance, but with precision. I explained what could actually be done and what could not. I softened what needed softening. But I never turned dishonest just to keep the room comfortable. That work never looks impressive in a report. No one at headquarters sees the labor it takes to pull a wounded relationship back from the edge of distrust. They only see that the signing still appears to be on the calendar and assume the system is healthy. But a deal like this does not stay alive because a meeting remains scheduled. It stays alive because the other side still feels that someone in your company understands them and respects what has already been settled. I was the person carrying that feeling for Belmar. I knew which brother would go quiet when he felt pressured, which phrase would trigger resistance, and where the final boundary sat, because I had spent that much effort stitching those cracks shut. I did not experience my removal as a foolish personnel decision. I experienced it as what it truly was, an internal strike against the weakest. Most vital part of a bridge I had practically rebuilt by hand. Victoria did not endanger the deal through one loud, dramatic move. She did it in the more dangerous way powerful people often prefer, through small edits that look harmless on paper and toxic in context. Shift the timeline so it suits an executive weekend. Tighten the language so it sounds stronger. Insert her name into the confirmation chain, as though her visibility itself validates the deal. On paper, each change looked minor. In the room, I knew exactly how those changes would feel to a family that had already swallowed too much disrespect. That is why I pushed back every time. Not because I wanted to hoard authority, but because I knew how much patience the Bennett family had already spent. Lauren had warned me not to make Victoria feel excluded. It sounded soft. Humane. Harmless. What it really meant was keep the work clean. Keep the deal alive. And keep the executive wife feeling centered while you absorb the irritation. I had done that for years. Which was probably why they assumed I would do it once again. This time, I chose differently. I did not send a dramatic complaint. I did not write a wounded manifesto. Before Ethan flew to Italy, I sent one clean email stating that as of that evening, I was no longer authorized to represent Belmar in the transaction. And for continuity and record purposes, I attached the last clean draft reviewed through my office. That was not defiance. It was documentation. It was my way of placing the truth inside the system before anyone could reshape the story into something more convenient. If you have ever seen someone save an entire situation by quietly leaving a clean record behind, like the video, most corporate battles are not won by the loudest person in the room. They are won by the person who leaves the clearest trail before the wrong people begin rewriting history. Lauren had called earlier with that cushioned human resources voice people use when they are carrying someone else's knife. She said there had been a temporary adjustment to the deal team so momentum would not be lost. The phrasing was almost insulting. Temporary adjustment sounds much neater than taking the woman who spent 13 days rebuilding trust and replacing her with a man who had never walked into that room. The chosen replacement was Ethan Cole. 34. Sourcing strategy. Smooth voice. Controlled posture. The kind of man companies love to send into high-level meetings when they want everything to look managed. Ethan understood cost structure, approval channels, and how to sound reassuring to executives. What he did not understand was the real history of the Bennett family. He did not know which phrases had offended them 2 months earlier. He did not know which concession had already cost them face. He did not know which clause had only been accepted because I had spent 3 separate conversations softening its edges. I did not think of Ethan as a villain. He was simply the kind of polished man systems choose when they want to prove that any competent-looking person can replace another person's invisible labor. As Lauren spoke, I felt a deep, cold clarity settle in me, not fear of being replaced. Fear of the category mistake they were making. They were confusing the ability to explain process with the ability to keep a relationship alive. In a domestic deal, that mistake might produce irritation. In a live international negotiation at the final stage, it could become a direct shot into the credibility of the entire company. And the cruelest part was that they were so convinced by the look of continuity that they never stopped to ask whether continuity without memory is continuity at all. The revised draft Ethan carried was not obviously disastrous at first glance. That was exactly what made it dangerous. Victoria had changed just enough to make it look stronger, to people who did not understand the lived history behind each line. Approval wording had been tightened. Delivery language had been hardened. And one subtle sentence pushed final discretion back toward New York, instead of leaving it where the Bennett family had already reluctantly agreed it belonged. Centralizing people call that kind of edit clarity. I call it a message. It tells the other side that the balance they thought had been reached is no longer being respected. It tells them your company wants to remind them who is holding the leash. Marcus Reed approved the changes because he belonged to that familiar class of operators who mistake movement for control. As long as the process is still moving, they assume the deal is alive. I did not waste energy sending a long warning that could later be dismissed as emotional resistance. I have watched too many women get neutralized that way, especially when they are right. Instead, I let the system keep the evidence. I sent the clean draft. I kept my language neutral. Then I stepped back. Stepping back was not surrender. It was strategy. It meant no one could twist my response into a fit of wounded pride. From that moment on, I knew Belmar was putting a polished man on a plane with a stack of paper. He trusted too much and a level of confidence borrowed from people who had never had to earn that room. I have seen too many collapses begin exactly that way. Not with an obvious blunder, but with confidence wearing the face of competence while lacking the knowledge that competence actually requires. I did not stop Ethan from leaving. I did not chase after headquarters to protect them from their own arrogance. Sometimes the only wise thing a person can do is stop cushioning the consequences others insist on creating. I stayed where I was with that sharp, the hollow feeling that comes when clarity is almost painful. I knew exactly what Ethan would walk into that weekend: the Bennett office. A revised draft with the wrong pressure points. And the borrowed confidence of New York. A man like Ethan can hold a room in a polished way. He can speak evenly, professionally, persuasively. But families like the Bennetts hear very quickly when someone understands the shape of a deal without understanding the emotional history that keeps it standing. I could picture him opening the folder and talking about continuity, efficiency, and streamlined authority. While the simple fact of his presence at that table already proved the opposite, the part that angered me most was not that they replaced me. It was that they replaced me and still believed they were entitled to uninterrupted trust from the other side. As if trust were a file that could be copied. It is not. Trust lives in memory. In tone. In who was there when the room got difficult. And in who did not run from the truth when it needed to be said. I knew the weekend might not explode into obvious chaos. Polite rooms rarely die with shouting. They die through rising coldness. Better questions. Sudden caution from people who had been ready to sign. If you want to keep following a story about how executive ego can push a live deal toward collapse, subscribe to the channel here, because what happened next was no longer about whether I had been insulted. It became a test of what a system does when it is finally forced to face the real cost of underestimating the person holding its most fragile trust together. Just as I expected, the weekend meeting still happened. But it had already changed species. It was no longer a signing conversation. It was a courtesy review wrapped in enough civility that an outsider might have mistaken it for progress. I was not in the room, but I know those rooms too well not to feel their temperature from a distance. Edward Bennett would have opened the folder, turned a few pages, and stopped exactly where the revisions signaled that Belmar was no longer consistent with what had already been discussed. His first question, because experienced people always choose the most revealing pressure point, would not have been about price or timeline. It would have been about the removal itself. Why was the prior lead changed at the final stage? Ethan answered, with the headquarters script, internal restructuring. Clean. Process-driven. Lifeless. Then Edward asked who had changed the wording. New York. Why? Why alter both the language and the representation, this close to signature? I know Ethan likely stayed calm. And that calm exposed him. A person who truly lived inside the negotiation answers with context. Sequence. Memory. A person holding only a folder answers with process. When Ethan said Belmar wanted a cleaner authority structure going forward, I could practically feel Edward closing the file. Cleaner for whom? That question kills theater because it forces motive into the open. No one had to raise a voice. No one had to slam a door. The room only had to cool by 1 more degree. And when the signing remained on the calendar for the beginning of the week, it was not safety. It was a pause. It was the Bennett family deciding whether Belmar still understood who was actually authorized to speak to them. What matters is that back in New York, Victoria probably interpreted that weekend as proof that she had been right. She and Graham still had their public schedule. Still had whatever social visibility they cared about. Still had a meeting that had not blown up in open conflict. I know that illusion well. People who spend too long around power often confuse silence with agreement, politeness with trust, and the absence of immediate collapse with control. But deals like this do not explode in front of you for educational effect. They wait until the documentation is clean, the language is precise, and the consequences are difficult to dodge. I could almost feel that false confidence from across the ocean. Victoria may well have texted Ethan to keep things moving. Graham may have assumed this had merely been a staffing adjustment. Neither of them understood the nature of the room they were dealing with. When a family like the Bennetts does not get angry in public, that does not mean they are easier to manage. It usually means they are watching more carefully and beginning to preserve everything as evidence. I thought about that all weekend. Not in panic, but in the clear way you think when you can already see the storm taking shape beyond the horizon. I knew they would leave the signing on the calendar. And that was exactly why headquarters would misunderstand the situation. They would mistake delay for safety. In reality, once your counterpart starts reviewing whether your authority can be trusted at all, the rules of the game have already changed. At that point, the question is no longer how to get the contract signed on time. The question is whether your company still looks like a party capable of governing itself under pressure. The week did not begin with shouting. No fists on a table, no dramatic confrontation. It began with a brief, cold notice written with the precision of people who had thought very carefully before deciding not to leave room for interpretation. The Bennett family placed the deal on formal hold. They would not proceed to signing as planned. Instead, they listed 3 reasons with brutal clarity. The lead negotiator had been removed at the final stage. Material language had been changed without continuity. And Belmar's authority structure now required review before any agreement could be signed. I did not have to be in the building to know what that would do to the air. Ethan would have called headquarters in that controlled male voice that often appears right before panic fully rises. From that moment forward, Belmar could no longer tell itself, this was just an irritating personnel dispute. This was not Claire becoming difficult. This was an international partner formally questioning how the company made decisions under pressure. That is a very different category of problem. It pulls in legal, operations, planning, finance, and all the people who previously had no interest in the emotional architecture of a negotiation. I could imagine the moment the truth finally touched Graham. By then, he would have had to see that I had not been removed from a trip. I had been pulled out of the exact stage where trust mattered more than the paper. And when you swap a person out at that moment purely for optics, serious counterparties do not read it as confusion. They read it as a warning about how your company really functions. Once that happens, every email, every edit, every chain of approval starts to mean more than the people who created them ever intended. By that afternoon, the mood inside Belmar must have shifted from irritation to caution. I have always recognized that change inside large organizations, it happens when people realize a bad decision may have left a record. Legal did not sweep in like noisy investigators. They are much more dangerous than that. They move quietly, precisely, and they ask for exactly the things that peel rationalization off the bone. They wanted the weekend email chain, the version history of the drafts, the approvals behind my removal, and every internal message tied to the draft. Ethan carried to Italy. If they did their jobs properly, the story would reveal itself sooner or later. Victoria may have been careful enough not to write anything blatantly reckless. People with informal power are often very good at standing just inside the line while believing that makes them safe. But a few sentences placed together can tell a whole story. Claire's becoming difficult. She needs a reminder. The deal must move without increasing her leverage. The wording needs to align with Monday optics. One sentence can be explained away. 4 cannot. Together, they describe exactly what happened. This was not an operational decision taken to protect the deal. It was an ego-driven intervention shaped by optics, and by a woman who mistook access for authority. I had been around corporate machinery long enough to know that once legal begins using language like governance exposure, the room never goes back to what it was before. From that point on, the people who believed they were merely teaching a female employee, her place had to face a much uglier possibility. Their own emails might now be the cleanest definition of the problem. The next day, Belmar did what large companies always do once they finally admit they have a crisis. They pulled everything from the files of the person they had just pushed out. Every draft I had touched. Every margin note. Every buried side comment. Every delivery adjustment. Every quiet warning that had once looked small. On the surface, it all appeared reassuringly organized. My records were clean, logical, sequential. Exactly the kind of archive that makes executives believe nothing truly depends on one person. And that was where the system hit its limit. Documents can preserve content. They cannot preserve emotional sequence. They do not tell you how long Edward Bennett will sit in silence when he feels pressured. They do not mark which phrase the younger brother will treat as an insult, even though it sounds legally harmless. They do not store the force of the moments when I had to soften a word, step back 1 inch, or hold eye contact and tell the truth in order to keep the relationship alive. Companies love to repeat that no one is irreplaceable. Structurally, that is always true. But during sensitive stages, some people are carrying the invisible part of continuity. And you usually only discover that after the files remain intact while the deal itself stops, knowing how to stand. Ethan tried to compensate for that gap with confidence. I do not blame him alone. Many men are trained to believe that a steady tone can conceal the places where they do not yet understand enough. With people like the Bennetts, that never works for long. Confidence without memory only reveals itself faster. And the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that Belmar would not be able to repair this with cleaner meetings and polished explanations. They had already damaged the one thing no memo can quickly restore. Then Ethan made it worse. By midweek, he sent the Bennett family a clarification memo, explaining that Belmar's authority chain had now been streamlined for efficiency. He copied Graham. He copied legal. And because Victoria wanted visibility, he copied her as well. In companies like Belmar, people often assume that more executive names on a thread create more credibility. For the Bennetts, it only confirmed the suspicion already forming in the background. This deal was being dragged into a family power display. Edward replied quickly, and the sentence he sent stripped the varnish off everything. They did not sign supplier agreements through family visibility. So please confirm in writing who actually held decision authority on Belmar's side. When I imagined that reply moving through headquarters, I could almost hear the collective pulse of the building shift. Because by then, The humiliation Victoria had wanted to deliver to me had transformed into measurable cost for the company. Merchandising would ask about seasonal readiness. Planning would ask how much flexibility remained. Finance would start modeling delay exposure. A personal insult had become a number. And inside most companies, people do not stop calling something a personality issue until it begins to show up in cost projections. I was not pleased to watch the damage deepen. Revenge is a shallow emotion, and never as satisfying as fantasy pretends. What I felt was colder and sadder than that. I knew none of this had needed to exist, if someone at headquarters had simply been brave enough to tell Victoria that power is not the right to enter every room you do not understand. But once people like her are allowed to confuse access with authority, the bill rarely arrives all at once. It arrives in stages. And by the time it becomes visible, everyone discovers the invisible labor they were so willing to disrespect. From there, the meetings inside Belmar must have multiplied almost by instinct. Legal in one room. Operations in another. Finance joining as soon as delay took on the shape of money. And people who had not cared about supplier relationships a week earlier suddenly speaking carefully about exposure, timing, and buyer confidence. I am certain that at some point legal stopped using soft language. They had to. Once a crisis reaches this level, euphemism only helps the people who caused it. This was not a supplier tantrum. It was a continuity failure with a documented interference trail. That phrase changes a room. It forces Graham to look at the situation as a governance risk created by informal family influence, rather than as his wife being inconvenienced by a difficult woman. Victoria may still have argued that I had made the Bennetts too dependent on one lead. But if that had truly been the problem, then removing that lead at the final stage for image reasons was even more irresponsible. Once that point is stated aloud, the room usually falls quiet, because there is no clean answer to it. Lauren was asked why human resources processed the change without flagging continuity risk. Marcus was asked why operations approved replacement coverage without insisting on a pause. Answers that begin with "we assumed" or "we understood" tend to sound very weak under the light of a formal hold notice from an international partner. By midweek, the risk oversight group had almost certainly been briefed. Maybe not the full board yet, but high enough to change posture and access. And in the middle of all of it, the central shift had finally happened. Belmar was no longer asking how to manage me. It had begun asking how to manage the consequences of what it had done. That is always the pivot point in stories like this. The person they tried to minimize stops being framed as the issue and starts becoming the clearest evidence of how badly the system misread its own dependencies. It was not until late that day that legal finally reached out to me directly. That delay alone said a great deal. They were not calling to ask me to calm down. They were not telling me to cooperate for the good of the company. They did not offer a decorative apology designed to soothe me while returning me to the same invisible labor. They asked what had actually been handed off. What had not. What part of the damage remained repairable. And where further concealment would only make things worse. That was the first time since Victoria's call that someone inside Belmar spoke to me as though I was the holder of reality instead of a woman needing to be managed. I listened carefully before I answered. Not because I wanted leverage for its own sake, but because I needed to know whether they finally understood the shape of the problem, if they still wanted to pull me back in as a tool, patch the hole, and then bury me under process again. I would not return. But in their tone, I finally heard the thing I needed to hear, an acknowledgement that this deal had to be placed back under someone who understood it, not under whoever best served internal optics. I realized then that my position had shifted. I was no longer the problem they wanted removed from the system. I had become a condition for the system's chance to restore credibility. That did not make me triumphant. It made me precise. There are moments in work when you are treated as though you are too hard, too exacting, too difficult. Then the decorative layer falls away. And those same qualities become the only solid ground left in the room. I did not say much in that first call. I only made one thing clear. If they wanted to know what could still be saved, they had to be ready to hear some very unattractive truths about how the damage had been done. By the next day, when legal arranged a call involving Belmar and the Bennett family, I entered it in a completely different position from the one they had expected me to occupy. I was no longer the woman whose job was to absorb strain and make everyone else look competent. I entered as a named condition. Before I discussed a single commercial issue, I laid out clear boundaries. Victoria was removed from all supplier communication effective immediately. No side messages. No visibility copies. No last-minute edits dressed up as executive perspective. The deal would revert to the last clean draft I had attached to my record email. If Belmar wanted me back in the process in any real sense, my authority had to be restored in writing before that call ended. No one would speak to the Bennett family in Belmar's name without that authority appearing on the record. And beyond the immediate repair work, I required a continuity protocol for sensitive international negotiations, so no one could ever again treat a living external relationship like a staffing slot. The point was not revenge. The point was that I would no longer allow the system to use my dedication as a shock absorber while preserving the structure that created the harm. No one argued. When an organization has exhausted most of its good options, it suddenly becomes far more capable of listening. I could hear the caution in Edward Bennett's voice, and I respected it. They did not owe Belmar an easy exit. To be honest, I did not want one either. Only conditions written clearly enough to survive memory could prevent internal vanity from returning the moment the first panic passed. That was what I needed. Not gratitude. Not symbolic respect. Structural limits. Because unless power is forced to stop somewhere concrete, it always drifts back to the people most accustomed to using it without accountability. The Bennett family did not sign that day, and I would have distrusted them if they had. Real damage never heals, because a few people at headquarters suddenly sound more humble. But Edward agreed to reopen the review path once Belmar sent a corrected authority chain with my name restored in the proper role. To May, that was the true turning point. Not an apology. Not strained faces in conference rooms. A serious counterparty defining the kind of structure they were still willing to trust. Inside Belmar, the consequences also began landing in more appropriate places. Victoria was removed entirely from supplier matters. Lauren received a formal warning. Marcus lost unilateral authority over replacement decisions in continuity-sensitive deals. And Graham had to say aloud what men like him usually avoid for as long as possible. Family interference had put the business at risk. I did not return to my old position as though none of it had happened. I stepped into a stronger one, defined not by patient endurance but by recognized authority. That distinction mattered to me more than any dramatic scene could have. There is an enormous difference between continuing the same work after public disrespect and returning under a changed structure that protects the work itself. I knew the difference deeply. Some people might look at this story and call it a satisfying reversal. For me, the important part was not who lost face. It was that the boundary of power had finally been drawn. In organizations like Belmar, what wears a person down is not always one spectacular insult. It is the endless uncertainty about where power is supposed to stop. When no one can answer that clearly, the people doing the hardest, quietest work are always the ones most exposed. By the end of that week, the Bennett deal had not magically returned to perfect health. Cracks created by broken trust do not disappear because an org chart has been revised into something prettier. But the process had reopened under cleaner conditions, with authority stated plainly, with limits on interference established, and with a structure that no longer allowed someone far away to intrude and call it governance. Belmar gave me a choice it had never previously imagined it owed me. Stay with formal authority and compensation that matched the work I had truly been carrying. Or leave after a fully paid transition, and let the company absorb the cost of nearly breaking something it did not understand. I considered that choice carefully, not because I doubted myself, but because I needed to distinguish between staying out of fear and staying because the rules had genuinely changed. For years, I had lived through the gray zones. Women in corporate life are constantly told to normalize, doing more than the title says, keeping crises away from the table, softening egos that refuse to mature, and then being praised as indispensable, right before being reminded that we are entirely replaceable. I was not going back to that cycle. If I stayed, it had to be, because the invisible labor I had been carrying was finally being dragged into the light and tied to real authority. No vague gratitude, no more expectation that I would save things quietly, so other people could remain photogenic. I knew this was a rare moment when the system was frightened enough to make changes it had delayed for years. And I also knew that if those changes were not written into structure right then, The old habits would come back faster than anyone was willing to admit. In the end, I stayed. Not for Victoria, not for Graham, and certainly not because Belmar had somehow transformed into a perfectly decent place within one chaotic week. I stayed because the terms had changed enough that staying no longer meant enduring. When the revised authority memo went out, my name sat where it should have been from the beginning: lead negotiator. Final commercial continuity review. No supplier-side revision without my written approval. Victoria was still in the building. But when the next Bennett call began, she was not on it. No speech. No theatrical revenge. Just an absence written into process. And to me, that was the cleanest victory possible. Graham kept his company, but he lost the luxury of pretending that family influence existed outside business consequence. As for me, I stopped confusing endurance with safety. I understood that some people do not break you with one dramatic strike. They keep testing how much disrespect you will normalize before the whole system finally shows its seams. They thought they were removing a difficult woman from a deal. What they actually removed was the last person still keeping the damage contained. And once that buffer disappeared, everyone was forced to see what I had known from the beginning. Competence does not always sit in the brightest chair. But when it is dismissed, cornered, and finally pulled away, the entire organization learns that lesson in the most expensive way possible. I did not remain because loyalty demanded it. I remained because the structure now recognized the truth I had been carrying all along. That is the difference between survival and power. Survival endures what it must. Power changes the terms under which it will ever be asked to endure again.